I headed the car across town. She rode with her head on my shoulder, pretty well at peace with the world. And that was the way I wanted her, of course. But me, I wasn't feeling so good. Mona didn't know how often her aunt counted her money. She'd only caught her at it the one time, but there were probably plenty of other times. The old woman could be doing it right when she sent Mona out to shop. And if she did it before I got that $3.45 back, it wouldn't take her 5 minutes to beat the truth out of Mona. Staples would have to return the money, and I'd be returned to jail. On a double rap, probably. The store's charges, and a charge of getting Mona to steal. I wondered if maybe I wasn't playing this the wrong way. I couldn't think of any other. Of course, if the old woman had had any real dough, it would be different. If she'd had thousands instead of hundreds, enough to do something with, enough so's you wouldn't mind sticking your neck out, I'd have known exactly what to do then. She was a worthless old bitch. She had something coming to her, and I was just the boy to deliver it. And hell, there didn't have to be much risk, because Pete Hendrickson had something coming to him, too. And if he wasn't built to be a fall guy, I'd never seen one. I knew just how I'd use Pete. A plan popped into my mind almost without me thinking. But for a few hundred, or even a few thousand. When and if I ever pulled anything like that, I'd be playing for the jackpot. One big haul, and then Mona, and... Suddenly I thought of something. Mona, honey, does your aunt have some other money around the house? I mean, if she hardly ever digs into this cash in the basement.
I guess she must have. She keeps it in her room, probably. I don't know, because the door's always locked and she never lets me go in there.
She must have quite a bit. After all, she's got the day-to-day expenses of the two of you, and...
They're not very much, Dolly. We eat mostly rice and beans and things that are cheap. I have to shop around, buy stuff that the stores are about to throw out.
Yeah, but still...
Dolly, I didn't want to tell you, but I've had to do that. You know, a lot. She made me, and that's where...
It made me sick to think about it, hustling this kid. We were almost to the stores where I was supposed to let her out. She started getting the shakes again.
Do I have to, Dolly? Can't we just take the money and...
No, baby, we can't. We'd have to do plenty of traveling. We'd have to have money to live on. This just ain't enough.
I could get the rest, Dolly. There's a lot more.
But you said... But she hadn't said that. I just assumed that she'd cleaned out all the old girl's cash. My hands were shaking on the wheel. I gripped it tighter, fighting to keep the excitement out of my voice. Let's just keep calm, baby. Now, how much is there? Tell Papa, baby. What do you mean when you say...
Well, I'd have to count off for what I gave the man at the store. And this that I...
For God's sake, spit it out. Just give it to me in round numbers. She gave it to me. My hands jerked on the wheel. I almost ran up on the curb. Mona, sweet thing, say that again.
100. Will it be enough, Dolly? $100,000?
I stared at her, stunned, and she looked at me, anxious, her breaths rising and falling. We were like that for a minute or two, her staring at me hopefully, and me too shocked to say anything. And then her face went dead again, and she said I'd better take her on home.
It's all right, Dolly. I'm not afraid anymore. She'll kill me, and then it'll be all over.
Hush, honey child. That ain't the way it's going to be at all. Tell me something, baby. Where'd an old bag like that get $100,000?
I'm not sure, but...
She couldn't remember much of anything about her early life. But the old lady had let drop a few things, and piecing it all together, she had a pretty good idea about the source of that $100,000. At least it sounded good to me. I started up the car again and drove on toward her place. One more thing, honey. I think I can work it out so you and I can go off together and... I couldn't get the words out, what I really wanted to say. I swallowed and made another try, coming at it from an angle. This Pete Hendrickson character, remember him, honey? Now just suppose that Pete... She shivered and turned her head, sick just at the mention of Pete's name. I'm sorry, baby. We won't talk about Pete anymore. What I was going to say was, suppose someone broke into your house and...
No, darling.
But, baby, if I...
No, you're too nice. You've done too much. I couldn't let you do it.
I swallowed, feeling like I ought to be disappointed, because this was the first crack I'd ever had at the big dough, and I figured it'd just about be the last. But I reckon that I was actually pretty relieved. I was glad that it wasn't going to happen. Well, all right. I just thought that...
She's got a gun. You might get hurt or even killed.
I was back in business again. We'd come to the shopping center where I was supposed to let her out. I pulled in at the curb and stopped. The old gal's counting on me coming back to your house. Remember, honey? I told her I'd be back. I laid it on the line for her. Not the whole stunt, because I didn't have it all figured out yet. But what was going to happen to the old woman? You don't have to mix into it yourself, baby. All you have to do is have the dough ready for me to grab and call the cops after I've left.
And then we could go away together then, Dolly? We could be together after that?
In a week or so, sure. Just as soon as things cool off a little.
Do it tonight, Dolly. Kill her tonight.
Of course, that was out of the question. A deal like this was going to take some planning. There was Pete Hendrickson to get a hold of and worked on. I told her we'd have to wait. Probably I could swing it Monday. Meanwhile, she was to beat it back to the house and pretend like everything was hunky-dory.
But what if she finds out I took the money, Dolly? If she finds out before Monday...
She won't. Beat it home now, and I'll talk to you again tomorrow night. I'll meet you right here around 8 o'clock. She hung back, scared as hell to face the old dame. But I sweet-talked her, kind of getting hard-boiled at the same time, and finally she took off. I watched her until she rounded the corner. Then I headed for home. Now that it was all settled, if, of course, I could suck Pete in, I began to get cold feet. I wasn't really scared. Hell, there wasn't anything to be scared about. And I sure wanted Mona, and I sure wanted that $100,000. But I just couldn't see myself doing what I'd have to do. Well, you're crazy, man, I thought. You're going to kill someone? You're going to kill a couple of people? Not you, fella. It just ain't in you. I got about halfway home, and then I jerked the wheel and headed for town. I'd hardly eaten anything for the last 3-4 days. Maybe that was what was making me so shaky and nervous. I wound up at the joint I usually ate in, a little combination bar and grill around the corner from the store. I sat down in a booth, and the waitress shoved a menu in front of me. I told her to bring me a shot and a bottle of beer. I'd settle on something to eat later. I was sitting there sipping beer, thinking and trying not to think, when a shadow fell across the table. "Ah, Frank, so you are here, aren't you?" I gave a little jump, and he grinned and sat down across from me. I asked him what he meant by that, so I was here stuff. "Little bet I had with myself. Oh, thank you, miss. A bowl of your delicious soup, if you please, and a tall glass of milk. As I was saying, Frank, I worked late at the store tonight, and afterwards I found myself in the mood for a bedtime snack. But I do so hate to eat alone, you know, and just on the off chance that I might encounter some friend, not you, of course. I had no idea that you would be eating out tonight. This looks like I'm eating. The wife had some girlfriends in tonight, so I got out of her way. How thoughtful of you, and how thoughtless of her to entertain on your first night at home. Are you and the little woman getting along all right, Frank? Sorry to disappoint you. Now, what's this bet you made with yourself? Oh, yes. I couldn't see you from the street, Frank, and yet I knew you were here. Aren't you interested in knowing how? I was curious about it, but I shrugged and said it made no difference. The atmosphere of the place, Frank, the look on the faces of those poor girls. If you don't like the food and the service here, why don't you go someplace else? What's the use? They're all alike. Oh, but... He studied me puzzledly. Then he smiled in a way I didn't understand. Yes, I suppose they are all alike, if... Yeah? Nothing. Frank, it's always such a joy to talk to you. I trust you're fully readjusted after your recent ordeal. You harbor no ill will toward me. A swell guy like you? How could I? I'm so glad. Incidentally, inasmuch as we are such good friends, fire away. How in the name of heaven did you get so deeply in the hole? After all, the other collectors also had the rain to contend with, and they didn't appropriate more than $300 in company funds. Well, you see, Staples... Yes, Frank? I couldn't tell him. I wouldn't have told him even if I could have found the right words, because it just wouldn't have been smart. Are you fed up, Frank? Is that it? Feel like your best efforts gained you no more than your worst? That existence itself has become pointless? Like I say, I couldn't tell him, but he hadn't missed it very far. I just didn't give a damn anymore. How about it, Frank? You may as well tell me now if that's the case. Hell, what's the difference anyway? He didn't bother to answer me. The difference was that if I couldn't earn my dough, I'd probably go back to stealing it, and I might skip out with a wad before he could nail me. Now, what happened to that money? A month or so later on, I could have told him to go to hell, but until everything had cooled off and it was safe to skip with Mona, I'd have to have a reason for staying in this crummy burg. I had to hang on to the job. You understand, dear boy, I'm not merely being nosy. If it's simply something shady or unwise, if, for example, you spent it on a woman or took a little flyer on the ponies... I looked up, meeting his eyes at last. With that last bit, he'd shown me how to get off the hook. He'd also opened the way for me to ask some questions. You remember that sales letter I showed you a while back from that oil company down in Oklahoma? I think you showed me at least a dozen. For a man with some pretensions to sophistication, you seem to have landed on a truly amazing number of sucker lists. But, oh no, Frank, you didn't send that outfit any money. Yeah, I guess I did, Stape. But I told you. I know. But look at all the other things you told me. About the chances you missed when you were running a store down there years ago, and... But, Frank, that was entirely different. I had a chance to buy land, leases, the real thing, not merely wild promises on paper. I'll know better next time. You could have got in on the ground floor, huh, Stape? It was his favorite topic, the one thing he'd really talk to you about instead of jabbing you with the needle. Once you got him on the subject of oil in this town where he'd managed his first store, he was a different guy. You never saw anything like it, Frank. Nominally, it was the sorriest land in the world. Then the boom came, and these poor farmers, people who hadn't had enough to eat a few months before, were suddenly rich beyond their wildest dreams. I whistled, wonderingly, cutting in on him, sliding in one of the questions I wanted to ask. I don't suppose they all cashed in that heavy, though, did they? I mean, some of them probably sold out too early, or... That's right, Frank. It just seemed too good to be true, you know. In a great many instances, the first leasehound that came along and shook 40 or 50 or 100 grand under a farmer's nose... Cash? You mean they actually swung that much cash at him? Oh, yes. The psychological effect, you know. And then these people were poorly educated and inclined to be suspicious of banks. Cash they understood. A check to them was nothing more than a piece of paper. What about the people like that, anyway? I'll bet a lot of them didn't know what the hell to do with the money after they got it. True. You or I, now, if I were able to get my hands on any substantial sum... He broke off, sighing, and dipped into the soup again. I had another round of drinks while he was finishing his snack. Then he left for his hotel, and I started for home. I still hadn't eaten anything, but I was feeling pretty good. The talk with Staples had warmed me back up on the deal. I didn't really know anything. All I had to go on was the few things that Mona thought she remembered, and the little that she'd picked up from the old woman's remarks. But with what Staples had told me, it seemed to add up. They'd lived down south at one time, Mona and the old woman, and some other people she couldn't remember. Her own folks, I figured. It must have been the south or southwest because it was warmer. And there'd been towers, oil field derricks, and that was about all she could tell me. Why they'd come up here to settle down, I didn't know. So there was a hole in the picture. But I didn't see that it was too important. Oil had been struck on their farm down south. The old woman had sold out for 100 grand, or maybe she'd got even more and was just hoarding the 100 grand. Low-down white trash, too miserly to let go of a buck, sitting on 100,000 and hustling her own niece for bean money. Yeah, it figured. I wanted it to be that way, so that's the way it was. I picked up a few groceries the next morning and had a real meal for a change. I ate and ate, grinning to myself, thinking by God they might think they could starve old Dolly to death, but they had another think coming. I refilled my coffee cup and lighted a cigarette. I sat back in my chair, relaxing. Pete Hendrickson was the next step. I'd look him up today on the quiet, and I choked and banged down my cup. Pete. I didn't know where the guy lived. The last address I had on him was the one he'd skipped from before he went to work at the greenhouse. And where the hell he might be living now, God only knew. He might not even have an address since he lost his job. He could be bunking in a boxcar or sleeping under a culvert. I jumped up cursing, paced back and forth across the living room. I thought, by God, I might have known it. I knocked my brains out to shape up a sweet deal and someone screws it up for me. I don't know how long I paced, cursing and ranting before I finally got a grip on myself. Then I got out the phone book, looked up the number of the greenhouse and dialed it. I got the foreman on the wire. I said, "Please, sir, it's Olaf Hendrickson speaking. It's very important that I speak to my brother, Pete." "Not here anymore, sorry." "Perhaps you could tell me where." "Nope, don't give out information like that." "Please, sir, it's..." "Sorry." He banged the receiver. I looked at the clock. 11:15, just about right. I got in my car and headed for the other side of town. It was pretty close to noon when I got to this beer parlor, the one just down the street from the greenhouse. I picked up the name and address as I drove by and stopped at a drugstore in the next block. I waited in my car until the noon whistles blew. Then I got out and stood looking down the street. My hunch had been right. Workmen were coming out of the greenhouse and making a beeline for the beer parlor. I gave them a few minutes to get inside and get settled. I went into the drugstore then and called the place from a booth phone. The phone rang and rang. Finally, someone snatched it off the hook and hollered hello. "There's a fellow there named Pete Hendrickson, one of the boys from the greenhouse. Will you call him, please?" He didn't answer me, just turned away from the phone and shouted, "Pete? Pete Hendrickson? Any of you guys named Hendrickson?" Someone shouted something back and laughed, and this guy spoke into the phone again. "He ain't here, mister. Ain't at the greenhouse no longer either." Gosh, I just got to talk to him. I wonder if there's anyone around who could tell me where... "Hang on. Any of you guys know where..." They didn't, or if they did, they weren't saying. "Sorry. Any other little thing I can do for you?" "Don't take a flying jump at yourself, you snotty bastard." Well, that had been my best bet, but it wasn't my only one. I drove into town and parked at the foot of Skid Row. I got out and started walking. I must have walked 15 miles that afternoon, past the employment agencies with bums hanging around in the front, past flop houses, past the greasy spoons, past the pool halls and wine joints and cheap beer parlors. I walked and walked, going around and around and around. And Saturday afternoon went away, and it was Saturday night. I was too jumpy to eat. I found a bar that wasn't too crummy looking and threw down a few double shots. Then I started walking again. He had to be here, someplace. Son of a bitch, he just had to. If he wasn't around here, then he must have left town and... No, he couldn't do that to me. They couldn't do that to me. 8 o'clock Saturday night. Still no Pete, and it was almost time to meet Mona. I went back to my car. I was higher than a kite. It was the kind of high you get when you got to do something and can't, when you've got to have the answers and you don't know any. What was I going to do now? What was I going to tell Mona? Tell her nothing. If I could dig up Pete tomorrow or the next day, fine. If not, and I'd better not hang around town much longer after that, well, she'd have a few days of hope before she found out the truth. And me, I wouldn't have had anything more than I was entitled to. Nothing wrong with that, was there? Nothing wrong, I said out loud. Dolly Dillon says there's nothing wrong with it. The rotten son of a bitch. So anyway, I admitted it, and I was mad enough at myself to bite nails. But I knew I was going to go right ahead just the same. She was waiting in the shadows of a tree a few doors down from the supermarket. She climbed into the car, laying a sack of groceries up behind the seat, and I stepped on the gas.
Where are we going, Dolly? I've been away from the house quite a while, and...
I won't keep you long. What's the matter? You act like you're not glad to see me.
Oh, no, Dolly. I am glad. But is everything all right? You're still going to do it.
Didn't I say so?
No later than Monday, Dolly. I'm scared to death she'll...
I told you, didn't I? You want me to put it in writing? I drove across a railroad spur, turned down a dirt road, and parked. There weren't any streetlights over that way, and there wasn't any traffic. I put my arms around her and pulled her against me. I kissed her and ran a hand over her. And what happened then was so wild and wonderful that... Well, I don't know how to say it. I've been around, see, but I'd never known anything like that before. Then it was all over, as far as I was concerned, but that didn't seem to mean nothing to her. I said, "Baby," and then I said, "My God, honey." And finally I said, "What the hell is this?" I shoved her away and got back on my own side of the seat. That seemed to break the spell, as they say in storybooks.
I'm sorry. I just love you so much that...
But how about a babe like this? Maybe I had the wrong angle on things. Maybe the old woman was just selling something to keep it from going for free. That thought went in and out of my mind fast, because even a fool could see that this kid was a doll, as sweet and innocent as they come. And naturally, with everything I was doing for her, with everything she thought I was doing for her, she wanted to do something special for me. That was the way I wanted it, the way it should be. After all the tramps I'd been tied up with, it was about time I met someone who was grateful and loving and appreciative. I told her she was swell, and everything was swell. I just hadn't wanted to hold her up tonight when she was already late. "About this gun your aunt has," I said, starting the car. "Where does she keep it?"
"Upstairs, in her room."
"She keeps the key to the room with her?" "Swell. Now you get your clothes straightened out, and I'll drive you back to the shopping center."
"Dolly, how are you going to do it?" "Dolly, I mean, I ought to know it."
"You don't need to know a thing. If you had it on your mind, you might accidentally give it away, so just forget about it."
"But..."
"All you have to do is be home Monday night between 8:30 and 9. Somewhere along there."
"You started to ask about Pete Hendrickson last night. What does he..."
"Nothing. Didn't look like I was lying about that. Pete wasn't going to have anything to do with it. I wasn't going to, and I felt sorry for her, but what could I do? Now leave it lay, will you? Here's where you get out." I handed her the groceries. "Now hurry home and don't worry about a thing. Everything's going to be fine." I leaned forward and kissed her, gave her a little punch. "Beat it, you hear me, honey? I want to see you move." She smiled. She beat it. I drove away. I made a few more tours of Skid Row, and it was still no soap. It looked like Pete must have jumped town. I got a bite to eat and bought a pint and drove home, figuring, well, hell, maybe that's the way it's supposed to be. I think I told you earlier that this shack of ours was on a railroad siding, that there was the tracks on one side and a wrecking yard on the other. So I drove home that night, and there was a string of cars shuttled onto the siding, an empty box and a gondola, and a couple of flats. And I thought, uh-oh, no damn sleep in the morning. They'll be humping those cars at 6 a.m., and I gulped. I stood staring at the open door of the boxcar. It was dark on that street. Ours was the only house in the block. I'd already locked the car, and I knew I'd never have time to get my hands on a wrench or something to slug with before this guy could get to me, because he'd already started toward me. He'd swung down out of the door of the box, a hell of a big guy, and was coming across the yard. I couldn't see what he looked like, but I reckoned he wasn't up to any good, or he wouldn't have been. He stopped about 6 steps away from me. "Dylan? It's Dylan, yes?" I sagged back against the car. Pete Hendrickson. He'd taken the 5 I gave him the night before and jungled up with some hobos down on Salt Creek. They'd all gone on a binge, and he hadn't woke up until tonight needing a drink, and some chow, and a flop, and there was just one guy he could think of who might hold still for a bite. I'd been so nice to him. He cleared his throat uncomfortably, misunderstanding my silence.
I did not go to your door, Dillon. Your wife, I was afraid of alarming, so I wait in the box until I hear your car and...
I snapped out of the jolt he'd given me. I'm glad you came by. I've been wanting to see you. Come on inside and...
better I had not. If you could just, well, $1 or $2 until I find work.
I took him by the arm. You need a lot more than that, Pete. Come on in, and don't worry about the wife. She's away on a little trip. I got him inside. I saw that the shades were drawn, and I turned on the light. I passed him the fresh pint and gave him a cigarette. He took a drink, drew a long drag on the cigarette. He leaned back in his chair, sighing.
My life you have saved, Dillon.
Maybe not your life, just about 40 years of it. I think that's the stretch in this state for raping a minor. It didn't register for a moment. He took another swig from the jug. He wiped his mouth and said I was a fine friend. And then he said,
What? Rape?
You heard me. Old Lady Farrell's niece, Mona.
A lie, it is. I...
He swallowed, and his eyes shifted away from mine.
With a girl I was, yes. Why not? I work, and that is some of my pay. It is agreeable with her, and...
It was, huh? Maybe she took it away from you, huh? And I thought, oh, you dirty bastard. You dirty lying bastard. You just wait. And she's a minor, a child in the eyes of the law.
But she is not. She could not be.
The old woman says she's a minor. She says you threatened to kill her and the girl, and then you took it.
But...
He lifted the bottle again. He stared at me, his eyes crafty.
I think maybe you not tell truth, Dillon.
All right.
Why would she do such a thing? I am not the first. Many others there have been.
I stood up and took out my wallet. I took out a $5. I held it out to him. And take the bottle along with you, too. You'd better have a good one before they pick you up.
I did not mean to offend. It is just...
Just for your own satisfaction, why don't you call the old gal up? There's the phone. Ask her if she isn't going to send you over the road just as soon as she can arrange it.
But if I did that...
But it isn't true, remember? I'm lying to you.
Dillon, how... What is...
I sat down in front of him. I looked him in the eye and began to talk. So maybe he wasn't the first one with Mona, I said. Could he prove it? And could he prove that she wasn't a minor and that she and the old woman had agreed to the deal? It would be his word against theirs, and he had a police record and a bad rep for drinking. Why was the old gal doing this to him? They'd had a knockdown, drag-out brawl before he'd quit working for her. She was out for blood, and she meant to stick him. Pete shook his head dully.
I do not doubt you, Dillon, but why does she tell?
Because she thought I was on her side, see? I lied. I went there trying to trace you down for the store, and you know it was just business with me. I wasn't sore at you at all. But anyway, she figures I am, and I play along with her, so just as I'm leaving, she says to come back and let her know if you're still there at the greenhouse. She's got an idea how we can make it plenty tough on you. Like I say, I wasn't sore at you. I'm really your friend, and I proved it, didn't I? So I go back and tell her you've quit the greenhouse, and then I ask her what the score is. I want to find out so I can tip you off. All she'll say is, never mind, the cops will find you, and when they do, it'll be just too bad. But I kept on hanging around, pretending like I'm burned up with you, too, and anxious to help her, and finally she tells me what she has in mind. I coughed and turned my head. Man, it was all I could do to keep from busting out laughing. His eyes bugged out like marbles. He was one scared bastard. I was afraid to try to talk her out of it, so I said I was all for it, but maybe she wouldn't be able to make it stick. Maybe it would be better if I looked you up and brought you there. Had a few drinks with you, and then suggested that we go over there for a party. We'd frame you. I told her, see? Yeah, it was wild, but he was a pretty dumb guy. And I guess he'd been pushed around plenty by the cops. He stared at me, his face turning green.
I have some time, Dylan. I can get out of town before...
How far would you get? The cops have your mug and prints. They'd pick you up in no time.
But what...
She gave me until Monday night. So Monday night, we go over there. I'll go in first and tell her you'll be along in a few minutes, and then you slip up on the porch. I tell her I'm sticking my neck out a mile, so how about a roll with a gal for my trouble? And she'll go for it. So then I say I've got to be sure she won't try to stick me sometime. She'll have to give me something in writing to show that she and the gal consented to the deal, that the kid's over 21 and she's done it before, and what's the matter?
A little strange, it sounds. You think she would do such?
Sure she will. It's a cinch.
Then why is it necessary for me to be there?
Why? For a minute I couldn't think of anything to say. I don't need to explain that to you, do I?
If you would not mind, please. So mixed up I am, I cannot...
It's because she's liable to think I'm trying to pull a fast one on her. So I step up to the door and say, well, here you are now. I want that statement. I want it right now, or the deal don't go no further. I'll tip you off and tell the cops it's a frame, and she'll be in a heap big trouble. He nodded, his face clearing.
Would you... You do not think perhaps you could go to the police now and...
I thought of that, but I'm afraid it wouldn't work. They'd probably lock you up while they were trying to get to the bottom of things. It's a messy deal, any way you look at it, even if it wasn't rape.
It was not, I swear it, Dylan.
It still looks bad. There are at least a couple of charges they could stick on you, and they'd damn well give you the maximum on each.
You are right, my friend. So, if you are willing to do me this great favor...
I owe it to you. I got you fired, and now I'm trying to square things. Anyway, it's a pleasure to put a crimp in that old bitch's tail. He told me I was a nice man and a gentleman again. He stood up.
So much you have done. I am ashamed to ask.
Sit down. You're going to stay right here until this is all over with. He sat down.
It is too much.
Nuts. I'm glad to have some company. Now, how about some bacon and eggs? His eyes filled up. I thought he was going to start blubbering.
My fine friend.
There's just one thing. You'll have to stay under cover. Keep inside the house and don't let anyone know you're around here. It wouldn't look good if the old gal decided to get tough and we had to go to the police. They'd figure that we were buddies.
I will do as you say.
I fixed him some grub. I went out and got more whiskey. I made him go to bed in the bedroom, and I took the lounge. I fell asleep fast, but about 3 in the morning I woke up feeling kind of cramped and like something was hugging me. Something was. The bedclothes. I was all tucked in like a 2-year-old. I started to lug the stuff back into him, and then I remembered Mona and the way he'd taken advantage of her. So I just took what blankets I wanted and dropped the rest on the floor. Let the son of a bitch freeze. He'd be plenty hot in the place he was going to. The next day was Sunday, and it was just about the longest day I ever spent in my life. Pete was pretty well leveled off of his binge. So he starts to worrying, wondering, firing questions at me, and frankly, my mind wasn't very clear. I started feeding him whiskey right away. I got out my collection cards and pretended like I was working, but I couldn't hedge him off. They kept coming, the whys and the whats and the hows, until, man, I was almost ready to murder him right there. God damn it, Pete, how many times do I have to explain it?
But so strange, it seems. Like a movie, almost. It is hard to believe that she will.
She will. Wait and see if she doesn't.
Still, it is so strange for her to be so angry with me over something that... For her to tell you of her plans and for you to...
All right, I'm lying. I made it all up, for Christ's sake.
Please, my friend, I did not mean...
What do you mean?
Well, I was just wondering. I merely wished to ask why...
I don't think he was actually suspicious. It was more as though he was afraid I was going off half-cocked. Or maybe I was setting a bear trap to catch a skunk, making such a big deal out of it that we were liable to get screwed up in the machinery. Anyway, he kept on fussing and quizzing until I couldn't take any more. It was about an hour or so after dinner when it happened. I'd gone out to the deli and bought enough grub to feed a horse, thinking that a good scoff would keep him quiet for a while. But all through the meal he was making with a talk, and afterwards he had to help with the dishes. I mean, he insisted on it. And the talk kept on and on and on and on until all of a sudden something seemed to snap inside my head. You're right. The whole thing's a damn lie. She isn't out to get you. I'm out to get her. She's got a pile of dough, see, $100,000, and no one else knows about it. I figured I'm bumping her off and grabbing it and making it look like you.
Please. Excuse, friend. I am worried and I talk too much, but now I will say no more.
I'm laying it on the line for you. Now get the hell out of here and forget the whole deal. He put both hands on my shoulders and pushed me down into a chair, looking apologetic.
Such a bum I am. So much you do for me, and nothing I do but chatter like a squirrel. Well, no more. Now you will rest, and dishes I will finish.
I don't want you to. All I want you to do is...
And I will not do it. Only the dishes I will do, and keep my mouth shut.
Well, I told him. And even if I'd been able to go on telling him, and I couldn't, he wouldn't have listened. He finished the dishes. He came back into the living room and he poured a very small drink for himself and a big one for me. He kept his word. There were no more questions, but I could see he was busting with them. And seeing him that way, it was 10 times worse than if he'd actually talked. I poured him a big drink. I made him take 3 or 4 big slugs, but it didn't seem to help much. I tried to get his mind off what he was thinking about, what I was thinking about. I got out a deck of cards and a box of matches for chips, and we played a few hands of draw. We switched from poker to Monte and then on to a lot of wild games like baseball and spit in the ocean. The cards seemed to help some. He began to hum, to kind of sing. First thing I knew, I was doing it with him. We grinned, and we came in on the chorus together. It was Pie in the Sky, as I recollect. By the time we got to the end, we dropped the cards, and we were laughing like fools.
Dylan, such a pleasure. Good friends, good whiskey, a good song.
We sang one song after another, keeping our voices down, of course. We sang and drank and talked. The day had been endless. It had taken everything I had out of me. Now I filled up on the music and the talk and the drink, and I got tight as a fiddle.
No more for you, my friend. Work you must do tomorrow, so now you shall have coffee.
Don't want any coffee. Want another drink. Want to talk. Want a
coffee, and then bed.
He went out into the kitchen. I heard the water go on, and then there was a lot of sloshing. My head began to ache again, and all the good feeling went out of me. I got up and staggered to the kitchen door. I stood staring at him, and the blood pounded through my brain. Why, what the hell kind of slop gut are you?
What?
He whirled around, startled.
I do not understand.
Why didn't you do it in the first place? You knew it had to be done. Everything was swell, and you had to screw it up. Why? Answer me, you dirty son of a bitch. Why didn't you wash out the coffee pot? I began to bawl. I started to slide down the door jamb, and he picked me up and carried me into the bedroom. That Monday, the next day, was a toughie. I couldn't concentrate on my work, and this was one day I had to concentrate. Staples had his eye on me. If I sloughed off very much, I'd be out of a job. And that job I had to have for a while. So I had the job to think about. And I had all this other stuff, the $100,000 and Mona and what I was going to have to do to get 'em. And the whole shittery was all jumbled up inside of me. I couldn't collect. I couldn't sell. I mean, sure, I collected and sold some, but nothing like I should have. As for the other, well, the more I thought about that, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The more mixed up I got. If there was ever a bastard that was going off half-cocked, I was it. I didn't know the layout of the house. I didn't know how long it would take Mona to get that dough out of the basement, or which room was her aunt's, or whether she'd let me into the place at night, or a goddamn thing. Worst of all, I hadn't laid the deal out for Mona. I hadn't rehearsed her and how she was supposed to act afterwards, what she was supposed to say to the cops, and so on. I hadn't done it because I hadn't really planned on going through with the deal. I'd figured that Pete had skipped town, and I couldn't go through with it. So there it was. Now it was too late. I didn't dare call her. Maybe I could catch her outside the house if I hung around the neighborhood long enough, but that wouldn't look good. People might remember seeing me later. And anyway, I didn't have the time. Wait. Put it off a night or two until I got a chance to talk to her? I couldn't do that. There was that story I'd given Pete, and then the old woman might discover that the till had been tapped. So there it was, like I say. I hadn't really made a move yet, and I'd already bollocksed to Framus. I got through the day somehow, and along toward quitting time my mind began to clear. I began to figure I hadn't done so badly after all. The money was there, wasn't it? And I had Pete sold, didn't I? And Mona would do what I told her to, wouldn't she? Everything important I'd taken care of, fine. All that was left was just a few details. Of course, it would have been better if I could have explained things to Mona, but it didn't really matter. Everything was going to be all right. And had to be. Take the most hard-luck guy in the world, and he's bound to get a break once in a while. I worked until after 6, trying to make a showing. The other guys had already checked in and left when I went in. And Staples was back behind the cash wicket, fidgeting and waiting for me. He looked through my sales contracts, the new ones and the ad buys. He checked through my collection cards and counted my cash.
A little light, Frank. I trust you can bulk it out with a good story.
What the hell? I've been off work for almost a week. Takes a few days to get back into the swing of things.
No, it doesn't, Frank. It takes exactly 1 day, today. Do I make myself clear?
So, all right, I'll do better tomorrow.
You will indeed. Much better. Otherwise, I'm afraid that...
I told him to stop making a production out of it. If I didn't do okay tomorrow, he could beef then. So he let it go at that, and we said goodnight, and I started for home. I would do all right the next day. If I couldn't do it legit, I'd feed a little of that $100,000 into the accounts. Just a few bills, enough to make myself look good. I got home. Pete was pretty uneasy from being cooped up all day, all set for another quiz program, it looked like. So I told him I had to take a bath, and he was to fix the grub I'd brought home, and that got him off my neck for an hour. We ate around 7:30. By 8, we were finished. I told him I had a little work on my accounts to do, and he was to wash the dishes, so that took care of him until 8:30. He came out into the living room, and then I folded up the collection cards I'd been playing with. I told him to get his hat and coat on, and he did, looking like he was about ready to pop. Then I gave him one of the 2 big drinks I had poured, and as soon as he got it down, I poured us another.
Dillon, good friend, there is something...
Drink, you drink. We're running late. He drank his drink, and I drank mine. I switched off the lights, took his elbow, and started him toward the door in the darkness.
It is only a small thing, Dillon, but it has been running through my mind since last night when we were...
I said we were late. Now, come on. He came along, but that question, whatever it was still bothering him. And all the way across town, he was kind of muttering to himself. I guess I told you that the house was out beyond the university. The only one in the block. Well, it was sitting off by itself. But I still didn't take any chances. I speeded up a little at the end of the adjoining block, then cut my lights and motor and coasted the rest of the way. I opened the door. I told Pete to stay in the car until I called him.
But I thought...
I know, but she might hear you come up on the porch. Figure that something screwy was going on and it would blow the whole deal. I left him sitting in the car, mumbling. I knocked on the door, and man, it sounded like an echo from my heart. The old pump was beating that hard. After a long time, the old woman tipped the shade back and peered out at me. There was only a dim light on in the hall where she was standing, but it was apparently enough for her to recognize me. She opened the door and unlatched the screen, and I went inside.
You bring my coat? You got it in your car, huh?
I didn't say anything. I was like a mechanical man with the batteries run down. I wanted to boff hell out of the old bitch, and I just couldn't move.
You bring it in, mister. That's why you came, ain't it? You bring in the coat, and then...
She winked and jerked her head toward the rear of the house.
She's already in bed, mister. And you just bring...
She shouldn't have said that. Honest to God, I planned it, and I'd already come 3/4 of the way, but if she hadn't said that, I don't think I could have gone any further. She brought it on herself when she said that. She asked for it, and she got it. I left-hooked her. I right-crossed her, just the 2 haymakers, fast. batting her one way then the other. I let her go down, back against the foot of the stairs. Her neck looked about 4 inches longer, and her head was swinging on it like a pumpkin on a vine. Kill her? What the hell do you think it did? Mona had been standing behind the living room drapes. Now she came out and she took just one look at the old woman, and then she looked away. And she threw her arms around me, shivering. I gave her a little squeeze. I pushed her out of the hall into the living room.
Dolly, what are we going to do?
I'll tell you exactly what to do. Now, which room is your aunt's?
At the head of the stairs on the right. Oh, Dolly,
Oh, for God's sake, save it. Where's your key?
I don't... Oh, maybe in her...
I ran out in the hall and frisked the old woman. I found a key in her pocket and took it back into the living room. Is this it? Now, what about the gun? In her room? God damn it, answer me. She nodded. She gulped and tried to smile, tried to get a hold of herself.
I'm sorry, Dolly. I'll do whatever.
Sure you will, and everything's going to be fine. I smiled back at her, did the best I could at smiling anyway. You go get the money. How long will it take you? Can you get it in 5 minutes? She thought she could.
But what are you...
Never mind, goddammit. Just go get it and leave the rest to me. Move, for God's sake. She moved. She turned and went off at a run. I went back out into the hall, slung the old woman over my shoulder, and carried her up the stairs. I got to the top and dropped her on the landing. I unlocked the door to her room and went inside. There was a chair, a bed, an old writing desk. Nothing else. No books, no pictures. And with an old house like this, an old woman like that, there should have been pictures. I opened the drop leaf of the desk, scared sick that there wouldn't be any gun or that it wouldn't be loaded. And I thought, man, oh man, how stupid can you get? You could have checked on that anyway. You've gone too far to back out. And if that gun isn't... But it was there. A big old .45 of all things, and it was loaded. And there was some money, too, a little roll of bills in one of the desk drawers. I took the money and shoved the gun into my belt. I jerked the drawers out and dropped them on the floor, and I knocked over the chair as I went back into the hall. I walked down the stairs a few steps. I reached back up and got the old woman by an arm and pulled her down head first. I left her lying about halfway down. I went on down the rest of the way, scattering the bills on the steps. I switched off the light, opened the door, and called to Pete. Then I went back up the stairs a little way and waited. I was sweating like a chippy in church. It wouldn't work. It couldn't work.